You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. In May of 2001, a building on the University of Washington's Seattle campus went up in flames in the middle of the night. It was the work of arsonists. Their target, the research of Toby Bradshaw. Here's the biology professor talking to KUOW after the fire.
I love my work. I don't intend to be intimidated by fire bombers, of all people, who can't engage in any kind of constructive debate. I spend much of my time, and I believe I'll spend a lot more of my time in the future, trying to find forums where we can have more constructive debate. I do think that a full and thorough public discussion is important, and I do think that an informed electorate is the best defense of liberty of all types, including the freedom to do academic research.
An eco-sabotage group known as the Earth Liberation Front took credit for the attack. Members torched the building over unfounded claims that Bradshaw was making genetically modified trees. The group committed a string of arsons from Colorado to Seattle. For several years, the FBI designated the ELF as the most dangerous domestic terror organization in the country. Ultimately, many of the group's most high-profile members were sent to federal prison. According to the federal government, the group caused tens of millions worth of property destruction in the late 90s and early 2000s. A new book tells the story of the ELF and how the loosely organized radical environmental group developed in the Pacific Northwest. Matthew Wolff is the author of Fires in the Night, the Earth Liberation Front, the FBI, and A Secret History of Eco-Sabotage. Matthew, thank you so much for coming in studio to talk about this. Obviously, deeply rooted here in the Pacific Northwest, this story.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Libby. Yes, the Earth Liberation Front started in around Eugene, Oregon, and most of their targets were in the Pacific Northwest, including, as you mentioned, in Seattle at the University of Washington.
So I wanted to start with just one of the activists, because you profile probably half a dozen or more of the people who took part in these eco-sabotage actions, the arsons. And the person that I wanted to start with was Joseph Dibby, who grew up here in Seattle. Can you kind of tell us his story, his path to taking part in eco-sabotage, and what it says about how these folks who joined ELF thought about environmental activism?
Sure. Joseph Dibby grew up in Seattle, and he was a kind of kid who his father used to take him up into the mountains. His father was an amateur alpinist, and Joseph Dibby was just one of those kids who loved nature. And he'd hike up there and just spend time in the trees and grew really attached to it. And then one day he went up there and found that this grove of trees that he really enjoyed spending time in had been clear-cut and was just gone. And it launched him into a career in activism. He was also a very skilled engineer. He worked at Microsoft for a while, a very intelligent guy, but he also had a deep commitment to defending nature. And eventually he became involved with members of the ELF and launched into a different kind of career involving arson.
You write that the group had guiding principles for carrying out this kind of activism. One of them was that they didn't want to harm people. They didn't want to do any physical violence, basically. They didn't want to kill anybody, hurt anybody. What were the underpinnings of the philosophical justification for going, not just out to protest, but actually out to destroy targets?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the ELF was very careful from the jump about destroying property but not hurting people. They carried out dozens of arsons. Nobody got hurt. Nobody got killed. They were really committed to property destruction, but with no casualties. So, I mean, the logic behind this was this thought that, we really were not doing enough quick enough to prevent ecological catastrophe. And there was this sense that they really needed to try something different. And the thing that they decided to try was sabotage using fire. There was this idea that industry is not paying a price for destroying the natural world, so we're going to make them pay a price. We're going to actually physically go after lumber companies, slaughterhouses, SUV dealerships, ski resorts that are encroaching on nature. And there was an idea that they would, it was like a tax that was being placed on people destroying the earth.
a lot of the people who ultimately planned or took part in ELF actions were part of this scene in Eugene, Oregon, this protest counterculture scene that, really centered on anarchism on one hand, environmentalism on another, just sort of a hotbed for all kinds of activism, often, had an anti-government, anti-police sentiment. I don't think that anybody who knows Eugene or who knows, frankly, parts of Seattle today would be surprised by this sort of milieu, right? But one of the things that struck me was how there was a part of ELF that grew out of a reaction to the more established environmental groups. So Greenpeace, Sierra Club. What was the folks who turned to the ELF's problem with those groups?
Well, to give a really short pocket history of environmentalism, environmentalism arose in the 1960s as a response to some of the problems that were becoming apparent of the prosperity that happened after the war. The U.S. was doing really well, but there was suddenly this awareness that at the same time the natural world was being destroyed. Some of the chemicals and other things that we were using were harming us and the planet. And environmentalism arose as a movement that was designed to sort of put the brakes on that or to establish some regulations. And it was enormously popular. Sort of in the early 1970s, everybody was an environmentalist. The big pieces of environmental legislation, like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, those passed Congress with either unanimously or something pretty close to unanimously. Everybody thought this was a good idea.
I mean, Nixon established the EPA.
And bragged about it.
Yeah.
He bragged in the State of the Union about saying, I'm going to put the most expensive pollution controls ever in place. And it was something that everybody got behind. Then in the late 1970s, industry started pushing back, and there was an awareness that this was a real threat to their profits. So they started throwing money into think tanks and lawyers and PR, trying to flip how people felt about environmentalism, where suddenly it was about government regulation being onerous. It was pollution instead should be thought of as like an individual consumer choice. It wasn't something that government should get involved in. And the Republican Party in particular really flipped on that. And, Reagan went from pushing really strict emissions laws as governor of California to making fun of environmentalists when he was stumping for president. So it was a situation where the environmental movement had been making these huge gains, and then suddenly they hit a wall. And for the big environmental groups, they decided, we need to be a little bit more conservative. We need to be a little bit more consensus-oriented. We need a compromise. And for a movement that was really based in the grassroots to begin with, this upset a lot of people. People felt like there shouldn't be compromising in defending Mother Earth. Like that's not okay. So a kind of break-off part of the environmental movement that became known as radical environmentalists decided that they were going to push for something a little bit more extreme, both ideologically by sort of just asking for more laws that protected the planet, and then also tactically, where they were going to not be afraid to break the law sometimes, whether that meant civil disobedience or whether that meant, certain types of property destruction, which they called monkey wrenching, like, putting sugar in the gas tank of a bulldozer, things like that to prevent the logging of a forest. And that movement became centered around Eugene, Oregon, a place that had a rich countercultural history, but was also an old logging town. And it was a place where, the kind of counterculture came crashing into capitalism and created a lot of fights.
Yeah, and you could get into nature so quickly from Eugene. Like so many places in the Pacific Northwest, people had a very close relationship with the forest, a very complicated relationship with the logging industry because so many people are involved in it, but then also so many people are opposed to it.
Yeah, a lot of people came to Eugene for the trees, whether to hike among them or to cut them down. And that created, there were a lot of protests out in the forest. And a lot of people who ended up joining the Earth Liberation Front started in those protests and tried to make a change and found themselves pretty frustrated.
How did you get the kind of access that you appear to have gotten to former ELF members who described these illegal actions? Because the book is written as if you are standing right there with the ELF with their gas canisters and their timers and they're setting things, and you have descriptions of their faces going white after something goes wrong, where the sun is, hitting them as they're like scoping out a target. there's a scene of an ELF member who's going to prison petting his elderly dog for the last time. What was it like to get the sourcing for this book?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wanted to make it as vivid and as sort of you are there as possible. And this involved reaching out to people who'd been in the ELF, some of whom had really not talked to journalists before. And I think enough time had passed that anytime you're involved in something that you feel, might have been historically important in some way or significant, I think, enough time passes and you want to talk about that and you want to figure out what happened and you want to think through it. And I think I approach people at kind of the right time for them to be a little reflective and maybe be in a mood to discuss things. But it took a lot of trust building. The media has not always been kind to people in radical politics. And I think it took a lot of just, getting to know people before they were willing to talk. But eventually, a number of members of the group were really generous and were really willing to recount experiences and thoughts about what they'd been involved in. And I was really lucky.
So the ELF burns various targets starting in 1996. Ranger stations, the ski lodge in Vail that was expanding into the lynx habitat, an SUV dealership in Eugene. There's even a dairy early on that one of the members decides to burn. What was the rhyme or reason in picking sites? Because they seem like they don't have a really strong thread connecting them.
Yeah, some of it was a little bit random. I mean, they had a lot of different causes they cared about that range from, global warming to logging. The ranger stations became a target because logging companies would hold auctions for forests, like national forests, like in the ranger stations themselves.
The U.S. Forest Service would hold those auctions.
Yeah, so there was this sense of the Forest Service being complicit in this, and there was a desire to try and stop that. But yeah, some of it came down to there was targets that would, really logistical concerns. Like, will this target, is it made of enough wood that it's going to burn? Is it a target that we know that there's nobody working a third shift or a security guard there late at night so people won't get hurt? Sometimes it would come from people just reading the newspaper. There was a slaughterhouse in Redmond, Oregon, that was a horse slaughterhouse. They were literally taking wild horses and killing them and selling them to other countries as meat. Somebody read an AP story about this and decided that this was really wrong. So they decided to burn it down. But yeah, there was a little bit of a random element, and it was not, there was no master plan for the ELF. A lot of it was very improvisatory.
The University of Washington attack comes towards the end of the really active period for the ELF. And there's a reason for that, which is that the University of Washington attack eventually becomes seen as a fiasco for the ELF. And we'll get to that in a second. But first off, why Toby Bradshaw, the biologist there at UW? Why did the ELF see him as a target?
Well, so a few ELF members, the ELF was not completely ideologically unified. There were certain members who really cared about some things more than others. Some people were really in it to save animals. Some people were in it to save trees. For a few members of the group got really exercised about genetically modified organisms. And there was some thought about it, being bad for human health. But also at a deeper level, there's this idea about when you begin to get into the genetics of plants and animals, you're really meddling with nature. And I think that resonated with some members of the group. So there's this idea that Toby Bradshaw was a prominent biologist at the time. Some members of the group had heard that he was genetically modifying poplar trees. And they decided there was this concern that if genetically modified poplars got into the wild, it could destroy a whole forest ecosystem. So they decided to target specifically his lab at the Center for Urban Horticulture at the University of Washington. There's this thought that if they just torched his office, they would impede his work and make it more difficult for him to do this.
The problem is that they succeed beyond what they were trying to do. They were trying to just burn his office, from what I understand from your book. But what actually happens is the whole facility goes up in flames. They do massive damage. And it turns out a lot of those assumptions were flatly wrong about the work that was being done there. Can you kind of tell me what happened in the aftermath of that attack?
Yeah, so as you said, it was a real fiasco. I mean, first off, Toby Bradshaw was doing an old-fashioned technique called crossbreeding, which is really where you're just trying to make two plants mate with each other and create a species of poplar that grows faster. And so they were completely wrong about that. He was not genetically modifying anything. They also had this idea that they could just burn his office, but his office was in the Center for Urban Horticulture, which was a part of the University of Washington that did some of the most environmentally friendly work in the university. So they ended up not actually destroying any of Bradshaw's data, which he kept elsewhere, but they ended up destroying the work of another professor who did research on saving endangered plant species, and burning large parts of a horticultural library that had very old, irreplaceable texts about plant species. And so it ended up being a fiasco for a number of reasons, both in the ideological premises of the attack and in what they ended up destroying, which was really harmful.
There were these incredibly rare samples that the researcher had been trying to propagate and successfully propagating, one of the rarest plants in Washington state, and the fire burned them to a crisp.
Yeah, this Professor Sarah Reinhardt had found this very rare species of plant with a great name of showy stickweed. And she'd, through really meticulous attention, had taken what were just a few samples of this plant and tried to build it back up and bring it back to health and nurture the population so that it wasn't quite so endangered. And her samples just got absolutely cooked in the fire, and it really set her back. So it was a situation where a fire that was supposed to be done in defense of the environment really did some damage to it.
Is this when public opinion fully turned against ELF? Because obviously there were people before who were not fans of arsonists, but there was also this sense that, they're, again, not harming people, and they have, a mission to try to wake up, the world about what's happening to the environment and really being warriors for the environment. But this event seems to be a turning point.
It didn't help. I mean, it was a few months before, they'd set fire to a whole dealership of SUVs in defense of or in protest of global warming. And I think that was received very differently than this, where they did damage to an educational institution, one that at least notionally is trying to help save the environment. So yeah, the group ended up breaking up, about 5-6 months later, shortly after 9/11. And I think it was in part due to some of the fractures that came out of this really colossal mistake.
Can you compare that action that you dubbed to like the horse rendering plant action, which the group generally saw as a success? Like, what were the key differences there? Yeah,
so great question. I mean, the horse rendering plant was a situation where it was this slaughterhouse in eastern Oregon where horses were literally being taken off the plains and just sold and killed as meat. And there had been a lot of attempts through conventional politics to try and get this slaughterhouse decommissioned, or to try and shut it down. Environmental groups had gotten involved, local neighbors who really, hated just literally hearing horses screaming, tried to protest against it, and nothing was working. So this is a situation where the ELF came in and said, look, if we've tried to make change the right way and it's not working, at the end of the day, what are our options? Well, let's burn it down. And it worked in the sense that the slaughterhouse was actually never rebuilt. A certain number of horses were probably saved by doing this. And so within the frame of what they were trying to do, it was a real success. With the University of Washington, nothing was saved. It was a situation where, again, the whole premises of why they were doing this were wrong. And I don't think it helped turn public opinion about the dangers of genetically modified organisms. So it was I think there were moments in which the ELF were really able to do what they wanted to do and succeed on their own terms. But ultimately, I think at that point, they'd been active for about 5 years, and it was really clear that they were not making the kind of progress. They were not pushing back against industry in the way that they had hoped. And so there was some sense of failure in the group.
We have to take a quick break. I'm talking with Matthew Wolff. He's the author of Fires in the Night, The Earth Liberation Front, the FBI, and a Secret History of Eco-Sabotage. We're going to talk more about how the group eventually unraveled and how the FBI zeroed in on them. People ended up going to prison for a long time. Coming up after this break on KUOW. Welcome back to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. I'm talking with Matthew Wolff, the author of Fires in the Night, The Earth Liberation Front, the FBI, and a Secret History of Eco-Sabotage. You might remember, if you're a longtime Seattleite, the attack in 2001 on the urban horticulture building on the University of Washington's campus, the burning of that building, the responsibility of the Earth Liberation Front. Matthew wrote about the history of the group, some of their reasons for doing what they were doing, and basically how everything started to come undone. Matthew, one of the things you really examine is this effort to rebrand the eco-sabotage movement as eco-terrorism. What was the importance of that, and what was behind that?
So eco-terrorism is a funny word. It was first used in the early 1980s, and it was actually used to refer to violence done against the environment. Like the first President Bush, for example, described when Saddam Hussein set all those oil fields on fire as an act of eco-terrorism because it was so environmentally destructive. However, there was a push by industry to really change what that word meant so that it would be used instead to refer to violence done in defense of the environment. And gradually, there was a kind of semantic creep that happened where eventually the word, instead of being used to describe actions that were inarguably violent, became to refer to a lot of different actions that were not quite as violent, like vandalism or even graffiti, or acts of sabotage against like a bulldozer, for example, was suddenly, if the bulldozer was disabled, that was described as an act of terrorism. And it was a really powerful word in the sense that it created a stigma around a lot of the actions that were being committed by the radical environmental movement. It was a word that industry used a lot and eventually got law enforcement to use as well.
And this is all supercharged after 9/11. At the point where the two towers are attacked and fall, the word terrorism suddenly has a brand new valence, and the FBI really zeroes in on the ELF in the coming years.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There was a situation where the ELF had already been described as a terrorist group, even though they had, again, been very careful about not hurting anybody, destroying property, but not harming people. But because this word was in existence that described them as terrorists, after 9/11, the FBI reorganized itself as one giant counterterrorism organization. And their goal was to go after anybody who might be described as a terrorist. And that included the ELF. And I think by having that framing, it made the ELF a huge target for federal law enforcement. And so the ELF ended up breaking up shortly after 9/11 for two reasons. Both, I think there was an understanding that the national mood at that point was not as whatever tolerance the American public had had for people burning down buildings under cover of night. That was not something they were into after 9/11. And then second, there was an understanding that federal law enforcement was about to come down on them like a ton of bricks, and that a lot of radical groups were going to be facing new surveillance and new prosecutions. So I think they did one more action, and then they went their separate ways.
And they flipped the federal law enforcement one key member of the group, Jacob Ferguson, who had a drug problem and was uniquely vulnerable, especially because, he had a son he didn't want to lose contact with. And he ends up informing with the FBI, cooperating, recording surreptitiously a number of members of the ELF. I mean, he's really the linchpin on the government's case against most of these members. And how do those cases go? I mean, they get serious prison time.
Yeah. So, the FBI did this thing where even though the group had broken up, they kept pursuing them for years afterwards. And they eventually got, as you said, Jacob Ferguson to a key member of the group to flip. And they effectively wired him up and arranged for him to go for a number of months to run into his former colleagues and, start talking to them and get them talking about some of the things that they'd been involved in. And so a number of ELF members were arrested and faced, again, really, as you said, really serious prison time. I mean, some of them were looking at, life in prison for the kind of property destruction that they'd been involved in. And so a lot of them had to make this really difficult choice about the group had been very tightly knit. They'd all been sworn to secrecy, and they'd all agreed that they were going to take the stuff to their grave. But instead, a lot of them had to make this choice about whether they cooperated and named names to the FBI or whether they stood fast and declined to participate. And it was a really difficult choice for them.
Maximum, I think that the most serious set of charges ended up getting in sentencing, was it like 18, 19 years?
Yeah, I think it was maybe the longest sentence was like 13, 14.
Okay.
But they had been, a few years before, Jeff Lewis, an activist down in Eugene, Oregon, had received 22 years in prison for setting a single SUV on fire as a kind of symbolic protest against global warming. So there was an awareness among the elves that the federal government was really in a mood to put people in prison for this. So it was not an empty threat on their part.
When you've talked to these ELF members, former ELF members, and they look back on the arsons, of course, in their sentencing hearings, they expressed remorse, but that's at a point when you're trying to convince a judge not to give you a huge sentence, right?
Yeah.
So I think the real reflection happens when you're out of prison and you're looking back. I mean, obviously, as you've said, these arsons did not harm anybody physically, but there was still serious damage done and serious psychological toll on a lot of people involved in the operations that were attacked. There was a professor at the University of Washington that you describe who ended up having to move because she was fearful of being physically assaulted or assassinated after the fire. I mean, this took a really big toll on her. So I'm curious, in your conversations, what is the level of reflection or remorse from former ELF members today?
It's a great question. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think anybody can imagine how traumatic it would be to have to go into work one day and find your workplace burned down. I mean, it's a place that's important to a lot of people. And even if you're not physically hurt, there can be real psychological damage that comes from that. I think among the elves, I mean, as we started talking about at the beginning of this conversation, I think a lot of them are still reflecting on it. They're still trying to sort of figure out, was it worth it? Was what we did it make some kind of difference? Some of them, I think, are sincerely regretful for being involved. Others, honestly, I think would do it again.
You talk at the end of the book about the fact that a lot of the fears that the ELF voiced that motivated them to become eco-saboteurs have started to come to fruition. The massive fires, the worsening wildfire seasons, the worsening effects of climate change, the accelerating, eradication of various species across the globe, things like that. When you look at the landscape today of the environmental movement, do you think that there will be a return of eco-sabotage? Has there already been a return of eco-sabotage?
I think the environmental and the climate movement are at a point right now where they're really trying to figure out what to do. I mean, it's never been an easy fight, but I think that particularly under the Trump administration, they're really being stymied. And I think that there's a question about what tactics are appropriate. You see this most recently with data centers, where, when I've been getting feedback from the book, some people have mentioned that explicitly as a situation where data centers are this thing that are coming into communities, are enormously polluting. Nobody wants them. But there's not really a way of fighting back against them with traditional politics. So when you place people in a situation where they're not allowed to make change the right way, they have to think about doing it in other ways. And I'm curious to see where things go over the next few years.
It's a fascinating book, something that has so much resonance here in the Pacific Northwest. And as we look at the future of the environmental movement, the future of how people react to, our worsening effects of all these things we've mentioned, climate change, et cetera. Matthew Wolff, author of Fires in the Night, The Earth Liberation Front, the FBI, and A Secret History of Eco-Sabotage. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks so much for having me, Libby. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.